The most reliable power plants in America, nuclear reactors, the ones designed to run every hour of every year, shut down before coal plants when rivers get too hot, not because they are failing, because their own safety rules force it. In August of 2012, an 880 megawatt reactor on the Connecticut coast went dark for 12 days. The first nuclear shutdown in American history caused by open body water that was too warm. Long Island Sound hit 77 degrees. The plant's legal limit was 75. Right now, 60% of the country is in drought. Lake Powell is receiving 13% of its average inflow, and the rivers that cool the backbone of the American grid are heading toward temperatures that the operating licenses of dozens of plants were never written to survive. If the idea that nuclear reactors shut down before coal plants in a heat wave got you locked in, take a second and hit subscribe to Orbital View. We're tracking the drought squeezing America's power grid in real time. River temperatures, reservoir levels, plant curtailments. Drop a comment and tell me, does your electricity come from a plant that sits on a river? I read every one. A reactor in Alabama bleeding $50 million because the Tennessee River got too hot. A dam on the Colorado sliding toward the elevation where it physically cannot generate a single watt. And the safety rule buried inside every nuclear plant's operating license that forces a shutdown before the heat even threatens the reactor itself. Let's get into it. Part 1. The drought that's already here. Right now, as of the first week of June 2026, the U.S. Drought Monitor, a joint product of NOAA, the USDA, and the National Drought Mitigation Center at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, classifies roughly 58% of the lower 48 as being in active drought. 1 week earlier, on May 26th, it was even worse, nearly 61%. Hold those numbers for a second, because the national average hides where the pain is concentrated. 93% of Colorado is in drought right now, not mild drought. 40% of the state sits in severe drought, another 27% in extreme, and close to 9% in the worst category the Drought Monitor tracks. Exceptional. That's the category they reserve for events that are supposed to happen once in a generation. Idaho is at 85%, and North Carolina, a state most people don't associate with Western-style water crises, is at 92%, with more than a quarter of the state classified extreme. But the place where this story grows its teeth, the place that turns drought from an agricultural headline into a grid reliability crisis is the Colorado River Basin. Lake Mead is the largest reservoir in the United States by capacity. It supplies water and electricity to roughly 25 million people across 3 states. And in early 2026, it dropped below 1,050 feet. The gauge read 1,049 and a quarter feet. The previous all-time record was 1,040 feet and 6 inches, set on July 28, 2022. And the Bureau of Reclamation's official forecast are what they call the 24-month study, released May 15, 2026, says Mead is headed to roughly 1,036 feet by the end of this year. The most probable scenario puts it at 1,020 feet by July of 2027. I sat with that projection for a while. 1,020 feet is more than 20 feet below the record, and the record itself was supposed to be an outlier. Upstream, the picture is just as stark. Cody Moser is the senior hydrologist at the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center. On May 7th, he released the April through July inflow forecast for Lake Powell, 800,000 acre-feet. He described that number in a way that stuck with me, the lowest flow on record and only 13% of the average for that period. 13%, not 80, not 50. 13, Lake Powell feeds Glen Canyon Dam. Glen Canyon generates a gigawatt of hydroelectric power, and there's a number built into the engineering of that dam that you need to hold in your head for the rest of this investigation. 3,490 feet. That's the minimum pool elevation. Below that line, water can't reach the turbine intakes. Below that line, a gigawatt goes to zero. The Bureau of Reclamation has been scrambling. They released somewhere between 660,000 and 1 million acre-feet from Flaming Gorge Reservoir, upstream on the Green River, to prop up Powell's level. Simultaneously, they cut Powell to Mead releases by 1.48 million acre-feet, from 7.48 down to 6 million through September 2026. They've acknowledged that those reduced releases could cut Hoover Dam's hydropower output by up to 40% as early as fall of this year, and they're not the only ones paying attention. NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, the organization that assesses whether the grid can handle what's coming, released its 2026 Summer Reliability Assessment on May 19th. The headline was cautious. Every assessment area can meet normal peak demand, and there's good news underneath it. More than 58 gigawatts of new generating capacity has come online since last summer, including 16.4 gigawatts of solar, 14.7 gigawatts of battery storage, and 6.7 gigawatts of natural gas. Those are real additions. They matter. But buried deeper in the report, John Mura, NORC's Director of Reliability Assessments, added a qualifier I don't think got the attention it deserved. The improved conditions we're seeing, he said, shouldn't be interpreted as saying that overall reliability risk is declining. And the assessment itself warned that early summer heat and drought conditions will increase reliability risks across several regions. That word, normal residual, is carrying an enormous amount of weight. Normal peak demand? But 2026 isn't shaping up to be normal. The snowpack that feeds the Pacific Northwest hydroelectric system, a region that gets more than half its electricity from dams, came in at 52% of average as of April 1st. NERC flagged the Northwest, New England, and SaskPower as elevated risk regions. 3 subregions on alert, and 2 of the 3 are there because of drought. Jenny Dumas, a water attorney representing the Jicarilla Apache Nation, said something that I think captures the whole situation in a single sentence. While we can exhaust our reserves to avoid system collapse this year, it means the reserves won't be there next year. That's the position. Federal agencies reshuffling reservoirs like a car dealer trying to keep the game alive one more hand. Grid reliability authorities saying everything is fine as long as nothing unusual happens. And a drought that has already exceeded what the planning documents call unusual. I need to be straight with you about what this investigation is and isn't. I'm not going to tell you the grid is about to collapse. The evidence doesn't support that. What the evidence supports is something more subtle, more structural, and in the long run, potentially more dangerous. A slow squeeze, tightening from multiple directions, on a system that wasn't designed for any of them. And it starts with a vulnerability that most Americans have never heard of. So the water picture is deteriorating. But what does any of this have to do with nuclear reactors and coal plants? Everything. Part 2. The power plants that can't survive their own safety rules. There's a fact about nuclear power that almost nobody outside the industry knows, and it is doing more quiet work in this story than any other single piece of evidence. Nuclear reactors are the first power plants to shut down when rivers get too hot. Not coal plants, not natural gas plants. Nuclear, the ones the grid was built to count on every hour of every day. The plants that are supposed to be immune to the kind of disruptions that knock out wind farms and solar panels. And the reason isn't a flaw. The reason is a safety feature, one that was never designed to handle what the climate is now delivering. Every nuclear plant in America operates under a set of legally binding rules called technical specifications. These are embedded in the plant's operating license by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And buried inside those specifications, in a section that doesn't get talked about on cable news, LCO 3.7.9, is a limit on the temperature of the water the plant pulls from the river, the lake, or the ocean. The NRC calls it the ultimate heat sink. Here's the plain language version, because this concept is the engine that drives the whole investigation. A nuclear reactor is, at its most basic level, an extraordinarily sophisticated way to boil water. The nuclear reaction produces heat. That heat turns water into steam. The steam spins a turbine, and then the steam needs to be cooled back into liquid water so it can cycle back and make more steam. That cooling requires enormous volumes of cold water drawn from outside the plant. But that cooling water serves 2 purposes. During normal operations, it keeps the electricity flowing by condensing the steam in the main condenser. During an emergency, a loss of coolant accident, a reactor trip, anything that requires the safety systems to kick in, that same external water source feeds the emergency heat exchangers. the ones designed to keep the reactor core from overheating. And here's the critical part. Those emergency heat exchangers were engineered, tested, and licensed against a specific maximum water temperature. The NRC's General Design Criterion 44 under Title 10, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 50, Appendix A, requires every plant to maintain what they call the ultimate heat sink. It has to be capable of removing residual heat after a shutdown and cooling the reactor for 30 days. Regulatory Guide 1.27, revised in November 2015, lays out the specifics. When the river water exceeds the licensed temperature, the cooling margin in the safety analysis shrinks. The heat exchangers can't reject enough heat to guarantee the assumptions in the design basis accident hold. At that point, the plant doesn't have a choice. The technical specifications require a power reduction or a shutdown. David Lochbaum understood this dynamic better than perhaps anyone outside the NRC itself. He ran the Nuclear Safety Project at the Union of Concerned Scientists for more than 2 decades, and he maintained what might be the only comprehensive database of water-related nuclear curtailments in the U.S. fleet. His explanation cuts right through the complexity. Coal plants are affected too, he said, but they don't have the temperature limit for safety reasons that nuclear plants do, and you generally hit that safety limit first. So nuclear plants feel the pain before coal plants do. Sit with that for a moment. The very thing that makes nuclear power safe, a hard, regulatory ceiling on intake water temperature tied directly to emergency cooling performance, is the thing that makes it the most vulnerable generation source when rivers warm. And these aren't theoretical limits, they're specific. Millstone Unit 2 on the Connecticut coast started with an intake limit of 75 degrees Fahrenheit. In April 2014, the NRC approved raising it to 80. Unit 3, same approval, same year. Braidwood in Illinois began with a cooling pond limit of 98 in 1986. That crept to 100 in 2000, then the plant requested 102 in 2014. Turkey Point in Florida went from 100 to 104 in August 2014. Every one of those changes represents a plant running out of margin. Spending the cushion that was supposed to be there for the life of the facility, not because the rules were wrong, but because the rivers and lakes and ocean water they were calibrated against don't exist the way they used to. And the distinction between the 2 types of temperature limits, intake versus discharge, is crucial because it determines who has the power to grant relief. The intake limit is an NRC safety rule. It protects the reactor. It can only be changed through a license amendment, which takes months or years. The discharge limit, on the other hand, is an environmental rule set under Section 316A of the Clean Water Act through NPDES permits. It protects fish, not reactors, and states can grant variances. That difference explains why nuclear shuts down first. A coal plant might violate its discharge permit and face a fine. A nuclear plant that exceeds its intake limit isn't facing a fine. It's facing a condition where its own safety analysis says the emergency systems may not work. The stakes are categorically different. And here's the part that makes this a compounding problem rather than a static one. Every time a plant raises its licensed temperature limit, and I just showed you 4 that have done exactly that, it's buying time, not solving the problem. The river doesn't know the license changed. The physics hasn't moved. What's moved is the margin between the legal limit and the physical reality, and it's moved in the wrong direction. Millstone's jump from 75 to 80 doesn't mean Long Island Sound stopped warming. It means the plant absorbed 5 degrees of future risk into its safety case. And there's a floor below which the NRC won't go, because at some point the physics of emergency cooling simply doesn't work at the requested temperature. We're not there yet, but the direction is clear. Part 3, how a power plant drinks a river dry. To understand why this vulnerability was designed into the system, and not out of it, you need to understand the plumbing. Picture a giant straw dropped into a river. The plant sucks water through that straw, runs it past the condenser where it absorbs the waste heat from the steam cycle, and then dumps it back into the river, warmer than it came in. Engineers call this once-through cooling. It's cheap to build. It's efficient. It avoids the cost and complexity of cooling towers. and it requires a truly staggering amount of water. According to the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, a conventional coal plant using once-through cooling withdraws between 20,000 and 50,000 gallons per megawatt hour. A nuclear plant running the same system pulls 25,000 to 60,000 gallons per megawatt hour. A big unit, 1,000 megawatts, can require condenser cooling flows north of 400,000 gallons per minute. The U.S. Geological Survey, in work led by Molly Mulpin, found that the thermoelectric power sector accounts for roughly 41% of all freshwater withdrawals in the country. Not consumption, withdrawal. The water goes back, but the volume is immense. And here's a number from the Energy Information Administration that surprised me when I first pulled it. As of 2020, only about 23% of U.S. thermoelectric net generation still uses once-through cooling. Most newer plants have recirculating towers, closed-loop systems, dry cooling. The fleet has modernized. But that 23% accounts for 96% of all thermoelectric water withdrawals, according to USGS data from 2015. 96%. The old plants, the legacy fleet, many of them nuclears, are the ones drinking the rivers, and they're the ones that can't stop drinking without shutting off the lights. The Union of Concerned Scientists documented 3 ways a power plant can fail from water, and I think understanding all 3 is essential because they attack at different points, and during a severe event, they can hit simultaneously. First, the river drops low enough that the intake pipe is exposed. The straw sucks air. Sometimes you can lower the pipe. The NRC has allowed temporary modifications at certain plants, but you're then pulling from the muddy bottom, risking sediment damage to the condenser tubes. It's a fix that creates its own problems. Second, the water coming in is too hot to actually cool anything useful. When the river itself is running at 85 or 90 degrees, passing it through a condenser doesn't accomplish much. The temperature differential shrinks. The thermal efficiency of the steam cycle drops. You generate less electricity per unit of fuel. And for nuclear plants, you've already hit the safety-driven UHS limit before you even get to this efficiency problem. Third, the water going back out is too warm for the law. Under the Clean Water Act, every plant's NPDES permit includes a maximum discharge temperature, designed to protect the downstream ecosystem. Alabama caps Browns Ferry at 90 degrees. Maryland allows 90 for its Use 1 and Use 2 waters covering Calvert Cliffs. North Carolina sets a limit of 5 degrees Fahrenheit above ambient ease, which means the limit drops as the river warms. So a plant can fail because the river's too low, because it's too warm coming in, or because it's too warm going out. And in a severe drought layered over a heat wave, all 3 can converge on the same facility on the same afternoon. That's not a hypothetical. It's happened. Now, there's a piece of context about the fleet that changes the stakes of everything I've just described. The water intensity of American power generation has been falling. In 2015, the fleet needed 14,928 gallons per megawatt hour. By 2020, that was down to 11,857, a meaningful drop, driven by gas and renewables replacing coal. The trend is real, but the plants most vulnerable to water disruption are the ones still operating. Many of them are nuclear. They're expensive, they're long-lived, they're sitting on rivers that are warming and shrinking, and they're not going anywhere soon. That's the structural bind. The fleet is getting less water-intensive overall, but the specific plants at risk, the big baseload facilities, the ones the grid leans on hardest during a crisis, are the most water-dependent generators in the system. They're the anchor, and the anchor is the thing that's most exposed. And the exposure is getting worse for a reason that connects directly to the drought data I showed you at the top of this investigation. There's a measurement that hydrologists use to capture how aggressively the atmosphere pulls moisture out of every surface it touches. Reservoirs, rivers, soil, leaves, everything. Think of it as the atmosphere's thirst. The technical name is vapor pressure deficit, and it's driven by the gap between how much moisture the air could hold at a given temperature and how much it actually contains. When temperatures climb, the air's capacity for moisture jumps, roughly 7% for every 2 degrees Fahrenheit of warming. When humidity doesn't keep pace, the deficit widens. The air gets thirstier, and it drinks from everything. A study published in Communications Earth and Environment found that a drier climate amplifies reservoir evaporation by widening that deficit and reducing cloud cover simultaneously. A double hit. More sun beating down on the surface, drier air pulling moisture off it. Huilin Gao at Texas A&M built the global lake evaporation volume dataset and found losses running larger than earlier models predicted across every major basin. An analysis cited by UCLA researchers estimated that roughly 10 trillion gallons of additional water evaporated from the Colorado River Basin between 2000 and 2021 ARS. Not from changes in rain or snow patterns, not from increased diversions, but purely from the atmosphere pulling harder because it's hotter. Lake Mead's climate runs 7 to 8 degrees warmer than Lake Powell's. Its evaporation rate is roughly 30% higher as a result, and both reservoirs are losing more water to the sky every year than the models assumed when the system was designed. So the rivers that cool these plants are warming because the air above them is hotter, and they're shrinking because that same heated air is pulling water off their surfaces faster than it used to. Both trends accelerate during drought. Both push the plants toward their regulatory limits from two directions at once. Intake water gets warmer while intake volume drops. That's the mechanism. Now let me show you what it looks like when it actually breaks. Part 4. The summer the Tennessee River got too hot, I could give you mechanism all day. But the mechanism only matters if the thing it describes has actually happened. So let me walk you through the event that proved it can. August 16th, 2007. Athens, Alabama. The Tennessee Valley Authority's Browns Ferry Nuclear Plant. 3 General Electric boiling water reactors. 3.8 gigawatts of total capacity, one of the largest nuclear complexes in the country. TVA shut down Unit 2. Not for maintenance, not for a fuel problem, not because of a safety system failure, because the Tennessee River, the body of water that provides the plant's entire cooling supply, had exceeded a 24-hour average of 90 degrees Fahrenheit. TVA spokesman John Moulton said it plainly that day. We don't believe we've ever shut down a nuclear unit because of river temperature. That was the first time. But the river didn't stay below 90 for long. 3 years later, beginning around July 8, 2010, the Tennessee River climbed back to the same threshold. Alabama's Department of Environmental Management enforces a 90-degree cap on Browns Ferry's discharge temperature. And when the river itself is already at 90, the math doesn't work. You can't add heat to water that's already at the legal limit. Browns Ferry spent more than 39 consecutive days running at roughly 50% power. 39 days. 1,500 megawatts, half the plant's capacity, ARC, unavailable. The Chattanooga Times Free Press reported on August 23rd that TVA had lost nearly $50 million from the curtailment. They were buying replacement power on the spot market at more than $1 million a day. Picture that from the grid operator's desk. Your dispatch plan assumes Browns Ferry is there, 3.8 gigawatts. Baseload, always on, and suddenly half of it vanishes. Not because anything broke, but because the river is too warm. You're scrambling to fill a 1,500 megawatt hole with expensive peaking power, and you're doing it during the hottest weeks of the year, when demand is highest and every other thermal plant on the system is also struggling with warm cooling water. TVA's response was telling. They didn't dismiss it as a one-off. Ray Golden, a TVA spokesman, said the utility was investing about $160 million in cooling retrofits at Browns Ferry. $160 million to solve a problem nobody had budgeted for. A problem that, as recently as the late 90s, didn't exist at this scale. Think about what that number means. If you're TVA, you don't spend $160 million unless you've looked at the projections and concluded that the river isn't going back to where it was. That's not a repair. That's an adaptation. And the price tag at Browns Ferry was just the visible part. The replacement power TVA had to buy on the spot market didn't come cheap either. When you lose 1,500 megawatts of nuclear baseload in the middle of summer, the market knows you're desperate. Prices spike. Neighboring utilities feel the draw. The whole regional grid leans harder in one direction, and every other plant on the system is also running closer to its own thermal limits. And the UCS data confirmed it wasn't just one plant having a bad summer. Between May and September of 2010, David Lochbaum's database documented 7 reactor units at 5 separate nuclear facilities, reducing capacity on at least 15 occasions due to water temperature. 7 units, 5 plants. 1 summer. That's not a statistical blip. That's a fleet-wide signal emerging from the data. But here's the detail that elevates 2010 from a cautionary story to an active pattern. The GAO, the Government Accountability Office, Congress's investigative arm, later confirmed that Browns Ferry had reduced generation due to river temperature in 2007, 2010, and 2011, 3 out of 5 summers. The river wasn't going back to normal between events anymore. The recovery periods were shrinking, the intervals between thermal curtailments were getting shorter, and the curtailments themselves were getting more expensive, and then 2012 happened. Part 5, the shutdown that rewrote the rules. The summer of 2012 was the worst drought to hit the lower 48 since the Dust Bowl era of the 1950s. By late June, 56% of the contiguous United States was in drought. By September, the number had climbed to 65%. It was the most widespread agricultural disaster since 1988, with losses running close to $30 billion. And on August 12, 2012, something happened on the Connecticut coast that had never occurred in the history of American nuclear power. Millstone Unit 2, an 880-megawatt pressurized water reactor operated by Dominion Energy, sitting on the shore of Long Island Sound, shut down because the water it pulls from the sound hit 77 degrees Fahrenheit. The plant's NRC licensed intake limit was 75. Long Island Sound had reached the highest sustained surface temperature since monitoring began in 1971. The plant stayed offline for 12 days. This is the event I keep returning to, and I think you'll see why. Browns Ferry, you could frame as a river problem. Rivers are narrow, they're shallow, they heat up fast in a drought. A reasonable person could look at the Tennessee River hitting 90 degrees and file it under small water body risk. But Long Island Sound is not a small water body. It's a massive estuary. Millstone pulls 1.4 million gallons per minute from open coastal water. If Long Island Sound can hit 77 degrees in August, FAO, and it did, then the assumption that coastal and ocean-cooled nuclear plants have a permanent margin of safety over their river-cooled counterparts needs serious re-examination. That same summer, the story played out in Illinois. Exelon's Braidwood plant, southwest of Chicago, uses a 2,500-acre man-made cooling pond to reject its waste heat. The pond's NPDES permit capped its temperature at 100 degrees Fahrenheit. That summer, the pond hit 102. Exelon went to the Illinois EPA for an emergency variance, permission to keep operating above the legal limit. Craig Nesbitt, an Exelon spokesman, explained the problem in a way that captures something important about the mechanism. It wasn't just the hot days, he said, it was the hot nights. The pond wasn't cooling down after sunset. The air temperature wasn't dropping far enough to let the water shed the heat it had absorbed. The overnight recovery that the cooling system was designed to rely on had simply stopped happening. Braidwood got its variance, the plant kept running, but that variance is a pressure valve, not a solution. Every time a plant needs a variance, it's spending a piece of institutional credibility it can't easily replace. And the NRC intake limits, the ones tied to safety, not environment, can't be waived with a phone call. Those limits require formal license amendment, analysis, review, public comment, months or years of process. And in July of 2012, the cumulative impact showed up in the fleet-wide data. U.S. nuclear production hit a 9-year seasonal low. Not because plants were down for refueling, not because of an industry trend, because the water was too hot in too many places all at once. And Millstone and Braidwood weren't even the full list. Prairie Island in Minnesota had cut output by more than 50% back in 2006 when river temperatures climbed. D.C. Cook in Michigan, 2 reactors on Lake Michigan, shut down on July 30th of that same year when a containment building exceeded its 120-degree limit. These events had been accumulating for half a decade before 2012 brought them all together in a single summer, each one individually dismissible as a local anomaly. Collectively, they described a pattern that the industry's own data couldn't ignore. Now step back and look at what the 2012 summer actually demonstrated, because most coverage at the time missed the structural lesson entirely. The same heat dome that was shutting down power plants was simultaneously driving record-breaking electricity demand. Every air conditioner in the eastern half of the country pulling harder. Every commercial cooling system cycling longer. Every hospital and data center and cold storage warehouse leaning on the grid at peak load. Supply contracting from one direction, demand surging from the other, both driven by the same physical event. Extreme heat. That's not just a grid reliability problem. That's the mechanism for a crisis that gets worse the worse it gets. Hotter temperatures cut supply and raise demand on the same day, in the same region, through the same cause. Michael Weber at the University of Texas called it something I think captures the dynamic perfectly: a recipe for future blackouts. And the scissors, the blades closing from both sides, haven't stopped. The drought covering 60% of the country right now is paired with summer heat that hasn't even peaked yet. The reservoir levels I showed you at the beginning of this investigation are headed lower, not higher. And the regulatory limits on every nuclear plant in the country haven't moved. The same numbers, on the same pages, in the same license documents, calibrated against rivers and lakes and ocean temperatures that no longer describe the world those plants actually sit in. And the evidence that this is a widening problem, not a narrowing one, shows up in a river system most Americans never associate with power generation. The Mississippi River at Memphis set a record low gauge, reading of negative 10.81 feet in October 2022. Then it broke its own record a year later, negative 11.91 to negative 12.04 feet on October 17, 2023. The previous record, from July of 1988, had stood for decades. It fell twice in 13 months. At Cairo, Illinois, conditions got so extreme in 2022 that Illinois American Water temporarily switched its entire Cairo district from the Ohio River to groundwater. The intake pipes were pulling air. More than 2,000 barges backed up on the Mississippi in October 2022. Barge shipping rates spiked from roughly $11 to $12 per ton to over $71. Coal-fired power plants that depend on barge-delivered fuel saw their supply chain freeze. The river that moves the fuel to the plants was failing at the same time the rivers that cool those plants were warming. But the scissors effect, as sharp as it is, still doesn't capture the full picture. Because cooling water and electricity demand are only two of the blades. There's a third one closing at the same time, from a direction most people haven't considered. And it starts with a different kind of power plant entirely, one that doesn't burn anything at all. Part 6, the country that already lived through this. And this is where the investigation crosses the Atlantic, because what I've been describing as a developing risk for the American grid has been a documented recurring reality in France for more than 2 decades. The French data gives us something the US data can't: a timeline, a before, a middle, and a partial after. France operates the largest nuclear fleet in Europe, 56 reactors. And those reactors sit on rivers, the Rhône, the Garonne, the Loire, that behave in a warming climate exactly the way the Tennessee and the Ohio and the Mississippi are beginning to behave now. What happened to those rivers and to the plants sitting on them is the clearest preview we have of what the American fleet faces in the years ahead. The European heat wave of 2003 was the hottest summer the continent had experienced since at least 1540. More than 70,000 people died across Europe. 14,800 of those deaths were in France alone. Many of them elderly, many of them alone in apartments without air conditioning, hospitals overwhelmed, morgues at capacity, bodies stored in refrigerated trucks outside funeral homes. And in the middle of that human catastrophe, a quieter infrastructure crisis unfolded along the rivers that cool the French nuclear fleet. EDF, Électricité de France, the state-owned utility that operates every one of those 56 reactors, lost 5.5 terawatt-hours of nuclear output that summer. To make that number concrete, a terawatt-hour is roughly the annual electricity consumption of 100,000 European homes. 5.5 of them, gone. Not from mechanical failure, not from fuel shortages, from river temperatures that made it physically impossible to discharge waste heat without devastating downstream ecosystems. The dilemma that summer was ugly. France, Germany, and Spain all faced the same question: shut the reactors and accept the grid instability, or exceed the thermal discharge limits and accept the environmental damage. Spain shut reactors. France and Germany, in several documented cases, allowed plants to run past the limits, trading river health for grid stability. Gulfesh, sitting on the Garonne, shut one reactor entirely. The decisions were reactive, emergency. Nobody had planned for rivers that hot. And then, in 2004, researchers published the first formal climate attribution study of a specific extreme weather event. They titled it Human Contribution to the European Heatwave of 2003. The finding? Human-caused warming made the event roughly 4 times more likely. That paper launched an entire field, event attribution, and it was anchored to the exact summer that proved nuclear plants could lose their cooling on a continental scale. But I'm not telling you about 2003 as distant history. I'm telling you because the pattern came back. And each time it came back faster. In 2022, France's fleet was already strained by widespread maintenance shutdowns and pipe corrosion problems found in several reactor pressure vessels. On top of that structural weakness, the summer heat hit. 5 nuclear plants received emergency waivers to operate past their river temperature limits. The government chose grid stability again, but the curtailment losses that year totaled about half a terawatt hour. That's a 91% reduction from the 5.5 lost in 2003. That reduction is real. France invested heavily between those years: cooling retrofits, dry cooling supplements, a shift to scheduling refueling outages in summer when thermal risk peaks instead of spring. The adaptation worked. And I think that's genuinely important evidence in this investigation because it shows the problem has a solution. An expensive one, but a real one. Then 2025 arrived and the pattern reasserted itself. On July 1st, EDF shut the Gulfesh plant, the same plant that lost a reactor 22 years earlier, when the Garonne hit 28 degrees Celsius, the regulatory intake maximum. The next day, in Switzerland, Axpo shut one reactor at Baseload and cut a second to 50% when the R exceeded 25 Celsius. EDF flagged potential cuts at Bugey, 3.6 gigawatts, Saint-Alban at 2.6 gigawatts, and all 4 Blei reactors totaling 3,600 megawatts. The French grid operator, RTE, confirmed the system stayed adequate. France exports surplus power, so the curtailments didn't cause shortfalls. But the French system has built-in margin that the American system doesn't share: 56 reactors. Substantial export capacity. The US runs tighter, and the American plants most exposed to this exact vulnerability haven't received the kind of targeted cooling investments that drove France's 91% loss reduction. What the French data proves is 3 things. 1. This isn't a freak event. It recurs, and the intervals between occurrences are getting shorter. 2003, 2022, 2025, with smaller events scattered in between. 2. It gets worse with warming, because the baseline river temperatures keep climbing, which means the regulatory thresholds get hit earlier in the summer, and at lower levels of extreme heat than before. And 3. Adaptation works if you invest before the crisis, not after. France's 91% curtailment reduction between 2003 and 2022 is the most encouraging number in this entire investigation. It proves the problem has a solution. The question this investigation is asking is which path the US is on. And the evidence so far, the plant-by-plant variances, the emergency license amendments filed after the fact, the absence of any fleet-wide cooling investment program, points toward after. And there's a cross-episode thread here that I want to flag briefly. If you watch the drought investigation on this channel, the one that documented the integrated Palmer Drought Severity Index, coming in within 1/10 of 1 unit of the Dust Bowl peak. The rivers in that video are the same rivers cooling the nuclear fleet I'm tracking today. The hydrology connects. The drought feeds, the fire weather, feeds the thermal limits, feeds the grid stress. They're not separate stories. They're the same story, viewed from different angles. The European mirror also reveals something about institutional response that's worth noticing. France treated the 2003 heat wave as a systemic warning. They committed public funds. They redesigned operational calendars. They invested in physical infrastructure. The curtailment losses dropped by 91% over 2 decades. In the United States, the pattern since 2007 has been more reactive. Plant-by-plant variances, emergency orders, license amendment requests filed after the fact. The fleet-wide strategic investment hasn't materialized, and the rivers aren't waiting for it. Part 7, the slow thermodynamic squeeze. Nobody talks about. Everything I've described up to this point, the shutdowns, the emergency variances, the $50 million losses, those are the dramatic events, the ones that generate headlines and press releases. But underneath the headlines, there's a quieter version of this problem grinding away at the fleet every summer, invisible to the public but measurable in the data. And it may matter more in the long run than any individual shutdown. A power plant is a heat engine, not a metaphor. The literal physics. It takes energy from a hot source, splitting atoms, burning coal, converts part of it into electricity, and dumps the rest as waste heat into the environment. The colder the environment you're dumping into, the more efficiently the conversion works. This has been true since Sadi Carnot wrote it down in 1824. It's as fundamental as gravity. When the cooling water entering the condenser is 55 degrees Fahrenheit, the system operates near its design point. The condenser creates a strong vacuum on the exhaust side of the turbine. Steam rushes in. The pressure difference is large. The cycle is efficient. When that water climbs to 75, the vacuum weakens. Back pressure in the condenser rises. The plant generates less electricity per unit of fuel. It's still running, still online, no alarms. But it's producing less power than it was designed to deliver. What makes this insidious is that it's invisible from outside the plant. No press releases, no regulatory filings, no emergency declarations. The control room operators see it in their gauges. The condenser pressure reading a little higher than normal, the net output a little lower. But to the public and the grid operator, the plant is simply available. The reduction shows up only in the generation data, aggregated weeks later, and even then, it's easy to miss unless you're looking for it specifically. And when the cooling water hits 85 or 90 degrees, the losses stop being subtle. Think of it as trying to cool your house when the air outside is 110, the system runs, it works, it cycles nonstop, but it can't hold the temperature you set on the thermostat. The physics won't allow it. Same principle, same limits. Recent thermodynamic analysis in the literature quantifies this. A 27 degree Fahrenheit rise in intake water temperature, 15 degrees Celsius, reduces the output of a large pressurized water reactor, a 1.45 gigawatt plant, by roughly 6%. 6% sounds abstract until you calculate what it means in megawatts. 87 megawatts, enough to power tens of thousands of homes. Gone. No headline, no press release, no emergency order, just a quiet erosion of capacity that shows up in the dispatch data and nowhere else. Michelle Van Vliet, working with John Yearsley and Dennis Lettenmeyer at the University of Washington, published a landmark study in Nature Climate Change in 2012 that projected where this thermodynamic squeeze is headed. They modeled thermoelectric vulnerability across the US and Europe under multiple climate pathways. Not just worst-case emissions scenarios, but moderate ones too. The headline, U.S. summer thermoelectric capacity could fall between 4.4 and 16% during the period 2031 through 2060. In Europe, the range was 6.3 to 19%. I want to sit with the low end of that range for a moment, because even the optimistic number is consequential. 4.4% of U.S. summer generating capacity is tens of gigawatts. During a heat wave, when the grid is already pressed against its ceiling, losing tens of gigawatts isn't a rounding error. It's a structural deficit that either gets filled by expensive peaking power or doesn't get filled at all. 4 to 16% of summer capacity. Hold that range, because summer is when demand peaks. Summer is when the grid runs hottest. and the models say summer is when the cooling water squeeze bites hardest. River flows at their annual low, water temperatures at their annual high, electricity demand at its annual maximum. All three curves converging on the same July and August afternoons when every system is already stretched. Van Vleet followed up in 2016 with an even larger global model, more than 25,000 power plants. The conclusion was direct. Water constraints were likely to severely reduce usable thermoelectric capacity after 2040. Not a worst case, not a tail risk, the central projection under mainstream climate scenarios. The International Energy Agency reached a similar conclusion independently, estimating that water-related constraints could reduce global thermoelectric capacity by roughly 12% by 2040. I want to be precise about what these projections are and aren't, because precision matters when the numbers are this large. These are model scenarios under specific climate pathways. They're not predictions the way a 5-day weather forecast is a prediction. They describe what happens to the power system if temperature and precipitation trends continue along the trajectories the models track. The uncertainty is genuine, but the direction isn't contested. Every major research group that has modeled this finds the same result: warmer rivers, lower flows, less usable capacity, more frequent curtailments, and the loss is concentrated in exactly the months when the grid needs every megawatt it can get. No modeling group has published a scenario where cooling water stress decreases. The trend lines all point one way. And here's the cost of the fix, because there is a fix, and the price tag explains why it hasn't happened. More than 70% of the roughly 1,100 gigawatts of U.S. power plant capacity requires cooling of some kind, and about half of that draws from fresh surface water, according to E&E News, reporting on DOE and USGS data. The vulnerable slice of the fleet is enormous. EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute, the power industry's own research arm, studied what it would take to retrofit the entire once-through fleet to recirculating cooling towers. The total exceeded $95 billion on a net present value basis. $42.4 billion in capital for 389 fossil facilities. $19.6 billion for 39 nuclear plants. $17.3 billion in extended outage costs. Plants have to shut down for months to build the towers, plus ongoing efficiency penalties and parasitic power for tower fans and pumps. $95 billion. And many of the plants facing the highest per unit cost are aging coal facilities with 15 or fewer years of remaining economic life. A $100 million cooling upgrade on a plant you're planning to close in 2035 doesn't make financial sense. So those plants just retire, and the grid loses the capacity anyway. The system is caught in a loop. Retrofitting is too expensive for plants near retirement. Retirement creates the generation gap that triggers emergency orders. Emergency orders keep running plants that can't cool themselves during the droughts that justify the orders in the first place. Every path circles back to the same problem: the water. And the slow squeeze isn't hypothetical. It's in the operational data. In the summers, where no plant hits its hard shutdown limit, the fleet still generates less power because every river-cooled facility is running slightly below its rated capacity. 1% here, 3% there. Across a fleet of dozens of once-through plants, those individual losses compound into a meaningful gap between what the grid expected to have and what it actually gets. And that gap widens on exactly the days when the gap matters most. Here's one more piece of evidence that I think pulls the whole thermodynamic picture together. Paul Behrens and Van Vleet published a follow-up study in 2017 looking at European thermoelectric vulnerability basin by basin. They found that the number of basins where water constraints significantly stress power generation rose from 47 in 2014 to a projected 54 by 2030. 7 additional river basins, crossing the line from manageable to stressed. That's not a global average. That's specific rivers in specific countries serving specific plants. And the U.S. equivalents, the Tennessee, the Ohio, the Illinois, the Connecticut coast, are on the same warming trajectory. Part 8, the third blade closing on the grid. And this is where the story takes a turn that most coverage of the drought completely misses. Because everything I've shown you so far, the nuclear shutdowns, the French curtailments, the thermodynamic efficiency losses, involves plants that burn or split something to make heat. But there's a category of power generation that makes electricity without combustion, without cooling water, without any of the thermal vulnerabilities I've just described. Hydropower, dams, the original clean energy, and right now, this third blade may be the sharpest of the three. Hydroelectric dams don't burn fuel. They don't need cooling water. They convert the potential energy of water stored behind a dam, water at elevation, into electricity by dropping it through turbines. In theory, they should be immune to the thermal problems plaguing coal and nuclear plants. But dams have their own Achilles heel. They need water behind them, enough water at sufficient height to reach and spin the generators. And the reservoirs feeding the biggest dams in the American West are draining toward elevations where the turbines can't physically operate. I walked you through Glen Canyon at the top of this investigation, a gigawatt of capacity, 3,490 feet of minimum power pool. Lake Powell's April through July inflow forecast at 13% of the historical average. But Glen Canyon isn't the only domino. Hoover Dam, downstream on Lake Mead, has already seen its output decline as the reservoir has dropped. The Bureau of Reclamation acknowledged that reduced releases from Powell, the emergency cuts they made to slow Powell's descent, could slash Hoover's hydropower by up to 40% as early as fall 2026. 40% of one of the most iconic power-generating structures in the country, not idled by a policy decision, drained by physics, and the cascade doesn't stop at Hoover. When hydropower drops, the replacement electricity has to come from somewhere, usually gas-fired peaking plants, which are expensive, carbon-intensive, and themselves dependent on water for cooling in many configurations. Every megawatt hour that Hoover doesn't generate has to be purchased on the wholesale market, often at peak demand prices. And in the Pacific Northwest, where more than half of all electricity comes from dams on the Columbia River system and its tributaries, the feedstock for those dams is snowpack. Snow falls in the Cascades and the Northern Rockies during winter, melts through spring and summer, and flows into the reservoirs that feed the turbines. The snowpack, as of April 1st, 2026, came in at 52% of normal, half the usual snow. That number feeds directly into reservoir levels, generation forecasts, and wholesale electricity prices across the entire Western grid. And unlike a thermal plant that can restart when the river cools, a dam with a depleted reservoir can't generate power until the next winter's snow falls, melts, and refills the basin. The recovery cycle is measured in seasons, not days. Researchers at Argonne National Laboratory, Poch, Conselman, and Veselka modeled what happens to Western power markets during a severe drought year. Average wholesale electricity prices rise between 7 and 34%, with the worst spikes concentrated in summer. For households already running their air conditioning flat out during a heat wave, a 34% jump in the underlying price of power doesn't just hurt. It forces choices between cooling the house and paying the other bills. And for grid operators trying to balance load against shrinking supply, those price spikes signal something more fundamental. The system is running out of margin. And here's where a live, contested policy fight plugs directly into this investigation. Since May 2025, the Department of Energy has been using an emergency authority it had never before exercised at this scale, Section 202C of the Federal Power Act, to prevent coal-fired power plants from retiring. The stated justification is grid reliability. If these plants close before replacement generation is ready, the grid won't have enough capacity to meet peak demand. DOE has now issued more than 16 orders covering at least 4.4 to 4.5 gigawatts of coal. The plants read like a roster of the cooling water-dependent fleet. J.H. Campbell in Michigan, somewhere between 1,400 and 1,560 megawatts. Eddystone in Pennsylvania, 820 megawatts. Centralia in Washington, 730. Schaffer and Cully in Indiana. Craig in Colorado, 427 megawatts. Keeping them running is expensive. J.H. Campbell alone cost an estimated $233 million in compliance, through early 2026, roughly 18 million a month. A grid strategies analysis prepared for Earth Justice, the Environmental Defense Fund, NRDC, and the Sierra Club estimated that forcing every fossil unit scheduled to retire by 2028 to stay online could cost electricity customers between $3.1 and $5.9 billion per year, and these orders now face the first ever legal challenge to 202C authority. The foundation for keeping these plants alive is being tested in court at the same moment the drought is undermining the physical case for running them. Because the coal plants, DOE is ordering to keep operating site on the same drying rivers, use the same once-through cooling systems, and face the same thermal discharge limits as the nuclear plants I showed you, shutting down in parts 4 and 5. Ordering them to stay online doesn't help if the river can't cool them. That's the paradox. And it gets sharper. The DOE orders were issued to prevent a reliability gap, but several of the plants kept alive by those orders are in regions where drought is simultaneously cutting hydropower and stressing thermal generation. Campbell sits on Lake Michigan, large enough that thermal limits aren't the primary concern there. But Craig in Colorado sits in a state that is 93% in drought. Centralia in Washington sits in a region where snowpack came in at 52% of normal. The blanket justification, we need these plants for reliability, doesn't account for the possibility that these plants may not be reliably available during the very conditions that create the reliability need. There's a phrase in grid planning of firm capacity. It means generation you can count on being there when you need it. The assumption behind every 202C order is that keeping a plant online makes it firm. But a plant that can't cool itself during a heat wave isn't firm. It's nominal. It exists on paper. And the gap between nominal and firm capacity, between what the planning models assume is available and what the physics actually delivers on a 112-degree afternoon, is where grid emergencies live. The 2026 Southwest heat wave that Yale Climate Connections documented, calling it one of the 6 most astonishing weather events of the century, tested these assumptions directly. When temperatures hit levels that rewrite the record book, every thermal plant on the system moves closer to its limits. The planning models that said capacity was adequate were built on historical temperature distributions, but the temperatures arriving now aren't historical. They're departures from the record, and the cooling water systems, the intake limits, the discharge permits, they were all calibrated against the old distribution. Part 9, who gets the water when there isn't enough. The last layer of the compound picture is the one that gets the least engineering coverage and the most courtroom time. Because when drought squeezes the water supply and multiple users need the same river, the question of who gets to keep drinking isn't decided by physics. It's decided by law. West of the 100th meridian, roughly the longitude of Dodge City, Kansas, surface water is governed by a doctrine called prior appropriation. First in time, first in right. The earliest claim on a river gets fulfilled first. The second earliest, second. And so on, until the water runs out. Everyone after that gets nothing. 0. Most power plants hold junior water rights. They were built decades after the farms and irrigation districts that claimed the water a century ago. When drought triggers mandatory curtailments, when a state engineer determines there isn't enough to serve everyone, junior rights get cut before senior rights. A nuclear plant generating electricity for millions can be legally told to stop pumping before a single farm loses a gallon. During the 2011 Texas drought, the state experienced conditions that tested every piece of that framework. Some areas endured more than 100 consecutive days above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The Texas Commission on Environmental Quality suspended approximately 950 junior water rights, concentrated in the Brazos, Colorado, and Neches River basins. 5 thermoelectric power plants held junior rights in those basins. The state exempted them, along with 3 municipal water systems, on public health grounds. But the exemption was discretionary, a judgment call by state officials. Under a different governor, a different water board, or a worse drought where farms were dying and ranchers were liquidating herds, that call could go the other way, and there's no federal override. Water allocation in the West is a state function, governed by state courts and state engineers applying a doctrine that predates electricity itself. The framework hasn't been fundamentally updated since the territorial era. It was designed for a world where there was enough water for the next claimant in line. Nobody designed it for a world where the river itself is disappearing while every claimant's demand is growing. Imagine being the state engineer who has to decide during a 110-degree week whether to cut water to a power plant serving 400,000 homes or to an irrigation district growing food for 1 million people. That's not a technical question, that's a political one. And the existing legal framework doesn't provide a clean answer. It provides a hierarchy that wasn't built for the choices this drought is forcing. Bridget Scanlon, at the University of Texas Bureau of Economic Geology, studied how the Texas power system adapted during that drought. The key finding, the system leaned heavily on natural gas. Combined cycle gas turbines need only about 30% of the cooling water that traditional steam plants require. Gas functioned as a drought resilience valve, and it's a big part of why Texas didn't experience cooling water shutdowns, despite enduring one of the most extreme droughts in its recorded history. Gas now supplies roughly half of all Texas electricity, a structural shift that, in water terms, has made the state's grid far more drought-resistant than it was a generation ago. But the valve has limits. Gas supply can be disrupted by the same extreme weather that causes the drought. Texas learned this during Winter Storm Uri in 2021, when gas wells froze and pipelines lost pressure. Gas prices spiked during precisely the kind of regional energy crises that drought-driven generation shortfalls create. And the pipeline capacity that delivers gas to power plants is shared with heating demand, industrial demand, and export terminals that send liquefied natural gas overseas. The escape valve is real. Scanlon's data confirms it. But it isn't unlimited, and it depends on infrastructure that has its own vulnerabilities. And a new competitor has arrived at the table that barely existed a decade ago. Data centers in Texas consumed an estimated 8 billion gallons of cooling water in 2024. That number is climbing fast. These facilities have deep corporate backing, the biggest tech companies on Earth. They're aggressively acquiring water rights, and they're claiming allocations in the same basins that power plants, farms, and municipalities depend on. Some of these data centers are being built specifically to serve AI training workloads, which are vastly more energy and water intensive than traditional computing. The competition for cooling water isn't just between the old claimants anymore. The pool of demand is expanding while the pool of supply is contracting, and the legal framework hasn't caught up. NERC's 2026 summer assessment surfaced one final connection that pulls every thread of this investigation together. New England, not a region you'd associate with Western water fights or Colorado River politics, was flagged as elevated risk partly because of declining firm imports. For years, the region has been counting on electricity imported from neighboring grids, primarily New York and Quebec, to cover peak demand. But when a heat wave blankets the entire eastern seaboard simultaneously, those neighbors are stressed too. Their own thermal plants are struggling with warm cooling water. Their own demand is spiking. The imports New England planned on may not be there when the call goes out. The mechanism is the same one operating everywhere in this investigation. Heat cuts supply. Heat raises demand. And when your neighbor is caught in the identical squeeze, mutual aid fails. The grid's assumption that regional stress is regional and someone else can compensate, stops working when the heat is continental. That's the full compound picture, assembled across 4 parts: cooling water, failing thermal plants from the inside, hydropower draining behind falling reservoirs, coal plants kept alive by billions of dollars in emergency orders that can't address the water their cooling systems require, agricultural, industrial, and data center water competition intensifying under legal frameworks designed for a world of surplus, and interconnection, the grid's ultimate backup, degrading when entire regions bake at once. I want to be honest with you about where the evidence stands at this point in the investigation, because I think the honesty is part of what makes this worth paying attention to. None of these individual failures, as documented, has brought down a regional grid. EPRI's own data, and I'll walk you through it in detail in the assessment, shows that weather-related nuclear curtailments across the U.S., fleet from 2011 to 2020, total less than 0.1% of total generation. That's their number. And it's a real number. The system has absorbed every cooling water event so far without a catastrophic failure. But the EPRI number describes the past. It describes a period before this drought, before Lake Powell hit 13% of average inflow, before Lake Mead slid toward 1,020 feet, before the DOE started issuing emergency orders to keep coal plants alive. The conditions that produce that comforting statistic are not the conditions the system is entering now. No single one of these failures needs to bring down the system on its own. They're all driven by the same physical event, extreme heat layered on prolonged drought, and they converge on the same summer afternoons, in the same regions, through the same shared mechanism. The question this investigation is now closing in on isn't whether any one plant will shut down. It's what the safety margin looks like when it's being consumed from every direction simultaneously. And answering that question honestly, which is the only way this channel does it, requires looking at what the evidence actually says about how bad this gets, including the evidence that says it might not get as bad as the headline implies. Part 10, what the numbers mean for this summer. Everything I've laid out across the first 9 parts of this investigation, the mechanism, the case studies, the compound connections, the international parallels, describes a system under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Now the question sharpens. What does all of this mean for the summer of 2026? Not in theory, not in 30-year model projections. Right now, for specific regions, specific plants, and the specific grid operators whose job it is to keep the lights on when 100 million air conditioners kick into high gear. I want to walk through this region by region because the vulnerability looks different depending on where you stand, but the underlying mechanism is the same everywhere. The Southwest is the most acute pressure point. Lake Powell's inflow forecast at 13% of average. Glen Canyon Dam sliding toward the elevation where its turbines physically stop turning. Hoover Dam facing a potential 40% output reduction by fall. And the Bureau of Reclamation playing a shell game with upstream reservoir releases that buys months, not years. The power that Glen Canyon and Hoover provide isn't decorative. It's woven into the dispatch plans of utilities across Arizona, Nevada, and Southern California. When it disappears, the replacement has to come from somewhere. And the options during a summer heat wave in the desert Southwest are limited, expensive, and themselves stressed. Gas peakers running on cooling water from the same depleted river system. Spot market purchases from a Pacific Northwest that is itself operating on half its usual snowpack. Emergency conservation orders that ask customers to reduce demand at the exact moment they most need their air conditioning. NRC's assessment said normal peak demand is manageable, but I keep returning to John Moore's qualifier. The improved conditions shouldn't be interpreted as saying overall reliability risk is declining. That sentence does an enormous amount of work. It acknowledges the new solar and battery capacity, 58 gigawatts added since last summer, a real accomplishment sheet, while simultaneously warning that those additions don't offset the structural vulnerabilities underneath. Solar doesn't generate at night when desert cities that absorb heat all day release it back into homes that never cool below 90. Battery storage helps bridge the evening peak, but can't sustain multi-day coverage during a prolonged heat dome that parks over the region for a week. And neither solar nor batteries solve the cooling water problem for the thermal plants that still generate the bulk of overnight baseload power. The Southeast carries a different variant of the same risk. TVA's Browns Ferry sits on the Tennessee River near Athens, Alabama. It's the plant with the longest documented cooling water curtailment record in the American fleet, derated or shut down for river temperature in 2007, 2010, and 2011, with the GAO confirming the pattern. The $160 million cooling retrofit TVA invested in bought genuine margin. The plant has operated more reliably since the upgrades, and TVA deserves credit for that investment. But margin against a river that's trending warmer decade over decade isn't a permanent solution. It's a timer. Alabama's 90-degree discharge cap hasn't changed. The Tennessee River's summer baseline has been climbing, and the thermal distance between where the river normally sits in July and where it hits the regulatory wall has been shrinking. To make this concrete, if the river's normal July temperature was 82 degrees in the 1990s and it's 86 degrees now, the plant went from having 8 degrees of headroom to 4, half the buffer, gone in a generation. The retrofits TVA built bought back some of that margin through engineering. Better heat rejection, more efficient cooling, but they can't repeal thermodynamics. If the river warms another 4 degrees over the next 20 years, which is within the range of the Van Vliet projections, the engineering improvements get consumed and the plant is back where it was in 2010, running at half power for weeks at a stretch. Farther east, the Catawba River in the Carolinas feeds several Duke Energy plants operating under standing thermal variances, permission that was already granted because baseline conditions had exceeded original permit limits. North Carolina, remember, is 92% in drought right now. Those rivers aren't just warm, they're shrinking. And every gallon of water that evaporates or doesn't fall as rain is a gallon that isn't available to absorb and carry away waste heat. The Midwest presents the cooling pond problem. Braidwood's 2,500-acre pond hit 102 degrees in 2012. Unlike a river-cooled plant, a cooling pond doesn't flush with fresh cold water. It's essentially a closed system, a giant bathtub that the plant heats on one side and tries to cool through surface evaporation and radiative losses on the other. When the daytime heat accumulates faster than the nighttime cooling can shed it, the pond's temperature ratchets up day after day. And this is where the loss of nighttime cooling, what climate scientists call the breakdown of diurnal temperature range, becomes a power generation problem as well as a human health problem. Craig Nesbitt's observation from 2012 was precise. It wasn't just the hot days, it was the hot nights. Overnight low temperatures across the Midwest have been rising faster than daytime highs for decades. That trend directly degrades the ability of cooling ponds to recover overnight. Exelon, now operating as Constellation Energy, has already petitioned for emergency variances at Braidwood. The variance was granted. But a variance is a pressure release, not a structural fix. The question for the Midwest fleet isn't whether another variance will be needed. It's how many, how often, and how close to the NRC safety limit, not just the EPA environmental limit, the ponds can climb before the physics of emergency cooling starts to erode. And the Northeast remains the region that rewrote assumptions in 2012 and hasn't stopped. Long Island Sound hit 77 degrees at Millstone, the highest since monitoring began. Coastal water temperatures in the mid-Atlantic and New England have been rising faster than the global ocean average, driven by shifts in the Gulf Stream and warming of the Gulf of Maine, which scientists at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute have documented as one of the fastest warming bodies of water on the planet. The warming isn't linear, it comes in pulses, with marine heat waves that can spike temperatures several degrees above the seasonal mean for weeks at a time. One of those pulses, landing during a terrestrial heat wave, is what produced the Millstone shutdown. Millstone's intake limit was raised from 75 to 80 in 2014. That bought margin, but the Sound has continued warming, and a strong marine heat wave coinciding with a summer heat dome, a combination that's becoming more likely as both ocean and atmospheric temperatures trend upward, could push temperatures past the new limit. NRC flagged New England as elevated risk for this summer, partly because of declining firm imports from neighboring systems. If Millstone or Seabrook or another coastal plant hits its intake limit during a heat wave, while those imports are reduced, the region faces a capacity shortfall that the planning models didn't anticipate, because the models assumed the plants would be available and the imports would arrive. The cooling water constraint invalidates the first assumption. Regional scale heat invalidates the second, both at the same time. Every region, a different version of the same vulnerability. Thermal limits on rivers in the southeast. Thermal limits on cooling ponds in the Midwest. Thermal limits on coastal water in the Northeast. Hydropower limits on falling reservoirs in the Southwest. And in each case, the temperature thresholds written into operating permits and NRC license documents were calibrated against historical climate conditions. Conditions that no longer describe the actual thermal environment these plants sit in. And that disconnect between the regulatory assumptions and the physical reality ours isn't static. It's widening, every year the baseline river temperatures climb a fraction of a degree, the margin between normal operations and the regulatory wall gets thinner. And every time that wall gets hit, at Browns Ferry, at Millstone, at Gulfesk, at Braidwood, it costs money, it costs capacity, and it erodes the assumption of reliability that the entire grid architecture is built on. Which brings up a question that I think is the most important policy dimension of this entire investigation. And it has to do with time. Thermal limits on rivers, thermal limits on cooling ponds, thermal limits on coastal water, hydropower limits on falling reservoirs. And in each case, the temperature thresholds written into the operating permits and NRC licenses were set against historical conditions that no longer describe the climate these plants actually sit in. Part 11, the timeline trap. There's a dimension to this problem that doesn't get enough attention, and it has to do with time. The plants most vulnerable to cooling water constraints are overwhelmingly the oldest plants in the fleet, the ones through nuclear stations built in the 1960s and 70s. The coal plants that were supposed to retire years ago but keep getting extended by 202(c) orders, by state reliability mandates, by the simple fact that replacement generation hasn't been built fast enough. These plants have remaining lifespans measured in decades, not years. The NRC has granted license renewals extending many nuclear stations to 60 years of operation, and some operators are now pursuing 80-year extensions, a concept that didn't exist in the regulatory framework until recently. Braidwood's license runs to 2046. Browns Ferry's 3 units are licensed through 2033 to 2037. Millstone Unit 2 runs to 2035, Unit 3 to 2045. Turkey Point in Florida, which already raised its intake limit from 100 to 104, is licensed through 2052 and 2053, making it one of the plants that would operate deepest into the warming trajectory. These aren't plants that are about to close. They're plants the grid is counting on for another 10 to 30 years. They appear in NERC's long-term reliability assessments as firm capacity. They're factored into state energy plans. Utilities build their financial models around them, and the rivers and coastal waters they depend on are warming at a rate that the Van Vliet models say will reduce usable capacity by 4 to 16% within that same operating window. And the rivers they sit on are warming on a trajectory that the Van Vliet modeling says will reduce usable capacity by 4 to 16% within that same time frame. The plant's licenses and the river's temperatures are moving in opposite directions. The licenses say you can keep running. The rivers say not at full power. The EPRI retrofit study priced the solution at $95 billion. But here's the timeline trap. Even if the money materialized tomorrow, the construction time for cooling tower retrofits is measured in years. A nuclear plant retrofit requires an extended outage. The NRC review process for a major modification takes months to years. Environmental permitting for the towers themselves, which can be massive structures, adds more time. From decision to completion, a realistic timeline for a fleet-wide retrofit program is a decade or more. A decade, during which the rivers keep warming, the droughts keep deepening, and the plants keep operating on margins that were never designed for what's arriving. And the fleet replacement pipeline that's supposed to fill the gap isn't keeping pace. More than 58 gigawatts of new capacity came online in the past year. That's real, and it matters. But a significant portion of it is solar and wind, which operate on different profiles than the baseload thermal plants they're supplementing. The grid needs reliable overnight power during heat waves. Solar provides 0 at 2 in the morning. Wind is variable. Battery storage is growing fast, but can't yet sustain the kind of multi-day, round-the-clock coverage that a nuclear plant provides. Advanced reactor designs, small modular reactors with passive safety systems and dry cooling that eliminates the river water dependency entirely, exist on paper and in various stages of NRC review. These are the designs that could, in theory, break the water energy dependency at the source. A reactor that cools itself with air doesn't care what the river temperature is. But the timeline is the problem. NuScale's small modular reactor project in Idaho, which was supposed to be the proof of concept for the entire SMR industry, was canceled in 2023 due to cost overruns. The target electricity price had risen from roughly $58 per megawatt hour to over $89, and the subscribing utilities pulled out. Other designs, from X Energy, from Kairos Power, from TerraPower, are progressing, but the NRC licensing timeline for a novel reactor design stretches years. The fastest realistic path from license application to commercial operation is the late 2020s, and that's optimistic. So the fleet, the grid, depends on today. The big light water reactors on rivers and coasts, the legacy coal plants kept alive by 202(c) emergency orders, the gas turbines that serve as the drought resilience valve, is the fleet it will depend on for the next decade and probably longer. And that fleet is facing a climate it wasn't engineered to handle. Governed by regulatory limits, it is steadily approaching on a timeline that is accelerating faster than the institutional response. The gap between the speed of the climate and the speed of the institutions is, I think, the single most important finding of this investigation. The rivers are warming now. The reservoirs are draining now. The snowpack is declining now. And the regulatory adjustments, the cooling retrofits, the fleet replacements, they operate on timelines measured in years and decades. The mismatch is structural, and it's widening. I'm not going to pretend there's a clean policy answer here, because there isn't one. Retrofitting is expensive and slow. Retirement creates capacity gaps the replacement pipeline can't fill. Emergency orders keep plants running, but don't solve the cooling problem. And building new generation solar, wind, batteries, advanced nuclear takes time and permitting and capital that the system is only beginning to mobilize at the necessary scale. What I can tell you is what the evidence says about the direction. Van Vliet's models, the French 23-year timeline showing recurring, worsening curtailments until adaptation investment broke the pattern. The Browns Ferry record getting worse across 3 to 5 year intervals until the retrofit. Lake Powell at 13% of average inflow. Every trend line points the same way. And the systemic investments that could bend those curves, the kind France made after 2003 haven't begun at fleet scale in the United States. The individual plant adaptations are real. TVA spent $160 million on Browns Ferry. Millstone raised its intake limit by 5 degrees. Braidwood obtained emergency variances. These are responsive, plant-level actions taken after each crisis. But the fleet-wide strategic program, a coordinated national effort to assess every vulnerable plant, prioritize retrofits, and build the dry-cooled or water-independent replacement generation needed for the mid-century climate. That program doesn't exist. There's no federal agency coordinating it, no legislation funding it, no industry consortium mobilizing it at the necessary scale. The closest analog is what France did, and France had a built-in advantage: one state-owned utility, one national regulator, one fleet, centrally managed. The American system is fragmented across dozens of utilities, 4 regional grid operators, 50 state regulatory commissions, and a federal-state regulatory split that makes coordinated action structurally difficult. The NRC regulates safety. The EPA regulates discharge. The states allocate water rights. DOE issues emergency orders. And nobody has the authority or the mandate to look at the whole picture and say, here's the plan for keeping the fleet running on rivers that are 3 degrees warmer than the ones these plants were licensed for. That institutional gap, not any single plant's cooling limit, not any single reservoir's elevation, may be the deepest vulnerability this investigation has uncovered. Part 12, the claims that circulate and the physics that answers them. There are 2 sets of claims that circulate around this topic, and I want to address both of them directly, because the people raising them deserve an actual answer rather than a dismissal. The first claim is that the drought itself is manufactured. You see this framed in different ways: weather modification, geoengineering, deliberate manipulation of atmospheric moisture. Sometimes HAARP gets mentioned, the High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program in Alaska. Sometimes the framing is vaguer. They are engineering the drought for some unstated purpose. The specific mechanisms proposed vary, but the core claim is that the water shortage is artificial, not natural. The impulse behind this claim is understandable. When you watch your reservoir drop to a third of capacity, when your river hits record lows 2 years in a row, when the forecast says 13% of normal inflow, the instinct to look for someone responsible is deeply human. The official answer, that the atmosphere is a complex system responding to warming, can feel insufficient when the consequences are this severe and this personal. But the physics doesn't support the claim, and the physics is specific enough to be definitive. Start with scale. The energy contained in a continental scale drought, the kind of persistent high-pressure pattern that suppresses precipitation across the entire western United States for months, is measured in exajoules. HAARP's maximum output is 3.6 megawatts. That's roughly the power consumption of a small shopping mall. To suppress precipitation across 1 million square miles of territory for an entire season, you would need to counteract convective processes driven by the sun's energy input to the Earth's surface, which runs in the neighborhood of 170 petawatts. The energy mismatch isn't a matter of degree, it's a matter of category. 12 orders of magnitude separate what HAARP can do from what a continental drought represents. That's the difference between a garden hose and the Pacific Ocean. You cannot steer a continent's weather with the electrical output of a strip mall. Cloud seeding, the actual real technology that does exist, operates at a hyperlocal scale. You fly a plane through specific clouds and release silver iodide or dry ice particles that serve as nucleation sites for ice crystals. The peer-reviewed evidence, after decades of field trials, suggests cloud seeding can increase snowfall by about 5 to 15% over a targeted mountain range. And even that estimate is debated. Some studies find smaller effects, and distinguishing seeded precipitation from natural variability is notoriously difficult. Several western states, including Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah, fund operational cloud seeding programs precisely because the effect is modest enough that every additional inch of snowpack matters. But what cloud seeding absolutely cannot do, and this is the bright line between science and conspiracy, is create or suppress large-scale atmospheric circulation patterns. The drought gripping the West is driven by persistent ridging, a dome of high pressure anchored by sea surface temperature patterns in the Pacific that deflects storm tracks northward and suppresses the vertical air motion needed to build thunderstorms across a region the size of Western Europe. The ridge itself contains more energy than every power plant on Earth could generate in a year. No existing human technology can create, move, sustain, or dissipate a feature of that scale. To put this in the most concrete terms I can, the energy difference between a drought-producing high-pressure ridge and the normal atmospheric circulation it displaces is on the order of tens of exajoules over a season. All human energy production, every power plant, every engine, every furnace on Earth combined, totals about 600 exajoules per year. The idea that a 3.6 megawatt research facility in Alaska could redirect atmospheric energy flows that dwarf total human output by orders of magnitude isn't just unlikely. It's physically impossible, in the same way that a candle can't boil the ocean. The energy isn't there, not even close. The reason I'm spending time on this isn't to mock the people raising these questions. The questions come from real frustration with real consequences. It's because the conspiracy framing actually makes it harder to address the real problem. If the drought is manufactured, then stopping the manufacturer fixes it. If the drought is a physical consequence of warming driven by cumulative emissions, which it is, then the path forward is adaptation, investment, and emissions reduction. Those are harder answers, but they're the real ones. But here's where the conspiracy framing gets unexpectedly interesting, at the one point where human activity genuinely does connect to drought severity. And it isn't weather modification technology, it's the greenhouse effect. The 2004 attribution study of the European heat wave found that human-caused warming made that event roughly 4 times more likely. Since then, event attribution has matured into a rigorous subfield with standardized methods and rapid turnaround analyses. Multiple studies have linked human influence to increased drought severity in the western U.S. through 3 specific mechanisms: reduced winter snowpack from warmer temperatures, increased evaporative demand, pulling moisture from soils and reservoirs faster, and shifts in jet stream behavior that steer moisture-bearing storms away from historically wet regions. Each mechanism is independently documented. Together, they produce the kind of multi-year, intensifying drought I've been describing in this investigation. The conspiracy says someone is engineering the drought. The science says we all are, collectively, through the cumulative effect of greenhouse gas emissions on global temperatures, which drive the evaporation rates, the river warming, and the snowpack loss that feed the cooling water crisis. The real human fingerprint exists. It's just distributed across 8 billion people and 2 centuries of fossil fuel combustion, not concentrated in a secret facility in Alaska. And that brings me to the second claim, which comes from the opposite direction. There are people, including serious credentialed energy analysts, who argue that the cooling water vulnerability is being exaggerated, that the curtailments documented so far represent a tiny fraction of fleet output, that nuclear and coal plants have operated through hot summers for decades without systemic failure, and that amplifying the threat serves an anti-nuclear political agenda by making baseload generation look unreliable. I want to engage this one carefully and fairly, because dismissing it would be dishonest. The evidence for manageability is real. APRI itself, the power industry's own research body, found that weather-related generation reductions across the entire U.S. nuclear fleet from 2011 to 2020 totaled less than 0.1% of total nuclear generation during that period. Less than 0.1%. That's their number, not an advocacy group's number, the industry's own measurement. And France demonstrated that adaptation investments can reduce curtailment losses by 91%. I'll present the full 3 interpretations, including the benign one, with every piece of evidence that supports it, in the assessment that follows. What I'll say here is that the data I've assembled comes entirely from NRC filings, USGS measurements, Bureau of Reclamation forecasts, peer-reviewed journals, utility company public statements, and federal agency reports. The mechanism is thermodynamics and regulatory design, not ideology. The curtailments have been manageable so far, and the conditions going forward are measurably, documentably worse than the conditions that produce the historical record those reassuring statistics are built on. Both the conspiracy framing and the dismissal framing want the story to be simpler than it is. One wants a villain, the other wants an all clear. The evidence supports neither. What it supports is a slow-moving structural vulnerability that has been survivable so far and is heading into conditions more severe than anything in the modern record. That's uncomfortable, but it's where the data actually lands. Part 13, the pattern is global. Before I move to the assessment, one more piece of context. Because everything I've documented in this investigation, the cooling water squeeze, the nuclear curtailments, the thermal discharge violations, the hydropower collapse, the scissors effect, is not uniquely American. It's a global pattern playing out wherever thermal power plants sit on warming rivers. France, as I walk through in Part 6, has been managing this for 23 years. But France has 56 reactors on rivers and has invested billions in adaptation. The United Kingdom flagged cooling water risks at several plants during its 2022 heat wave, the one that saw temperatures in England exceed 40 degrees Celsius for the first time in recorded history. India's coal fleet, the world's second largest, experienced widespread curtailments during its 2024 pre-monsoon heat wave when reservoir levels dropped and river temperatures spiked. Van Vliet's 2016 study modeled more than 25,000 plants globally and found the same pattern on every continent where thermal generation depends on river cooling. The timing varies by region. The mechanism doesn't. Warming air raises water temperatures. Drought reduces river flows. Evaporation accelerates losses from reservoirs. And wherever regulatory frameworks govern discharge temperatures, or wherever safety rules cap intake temperatures, plants hit walls. In India, the connection between water stress and power generation has become an annual crisis that the country's grid operators now plan around. During the 2024 pre-monsoon heat wave, when temperatures across northern India exceeded 50 degrees Celsius in several cities, coal plant curtailments due to low reservoir levels and high intake water temperatures contributed to rolling load shedding across multiple states. India's Central Electricity Authority reported that dozens of thermal stations, operated below half capacity for weeks because there wasn't enough water to cool them. The country's coal fleet, the second largest on Earth, after China's east, sits on rivers fed by Himalayan glacial melt and monsoon rains, both of which are becoming less predictable and less reliable as the climate shifts. The glaciers are retreating. The monsoon onset is more variable, and the baseline demand for electricity is rising as India urbanizes and incomes grow. China faces its own version. The 2022 Sichuan drought dropped reservoir levels on the upper Yangtze system to their lowest recorded values. Sichuan province, which normally generates more than 80% of its electricity from hydropower, was forced to impose emergency rationing on industrial users and redirect every available kilowatt to residential cooling. Factories shut down, supply chains disrupted, and the coal plants that were supposed to backstop the hydro shortfall were themselves struggling with low river levels and high cooling water temperatures on tributaries that had never run this warm this early in the season. The cascade was structurally identical to the one I've documented in this investigation. Drought cuts hydro output, forces heavier reliance on thermal plants, but those thermal plants face the same water constraints from the same drought. The global dimension matters for the U.S. because it eliminates the possibility that what we're seeing is a statistical artifact of American geography or regulatory quirk. It isn't. France sees it on the Rhone, Switzerland sees it on the Aire, India sees it on the Ganges tributaries, China sees it on the Yangtze. The physics operates identically everywhere. Any power plant designed to reject waste heat into a body of water that is warming and shrinking will eventually run out of thermal room. And the global data contains one more lesson that I think is directly relevant to the U.S. assessment. In every country where the cooling water problem has manifested, the institutional response has followed the same arc. Denial, then surprise, then reactive plant-by-plant fixes. Then, in the best case, the French case, systemic investment that dramatically reduces the losses. The United States is currently in the reactive plant-by-plant phase. The question, the final part of this investigation, is built to answer, as honestly as the evidence permits, is how much time remains before conditions force the systemic response and what happens to the grid in the gap between. Three interpretations of this evidence are defensible. One says the system is managing, one says it's degrading, one says it's approaching a threshold. Each has named sources and specific data behind it, and the specific observations that would distinguish between them, the trigger benchmarks, are measurable, trackable, and happening in real time. That's where we're headed next. Part 14, the case that the system is managing. I've spent 13 parts building the evidence. Drought data, reservoir projections, plant-by-plant regulatory limits, case studies spanning 2 decades and 2 continents, compound connections linking cooling water to hydropower, to coal policy, to water law, to grid interconnection. Now I owe you the assessment, and the assessment has to be honest, which means presenting 3 defensible interpretations of the same evidence, starting with the one that should reassure you and giving it genuine weight, not as a courtesy, not as a rhetorical device before I knock it down, because this interpretation has real evidence behind it, and the people who hold it include some of the most knowledgeable grid experts in the country. The first interpretation says the cooling water vulnerability is real, it's documented, and it will continue to produce individual plant curtailments, but it is manageable. The system has already demonstrated its capacity to absorb these events without catastrophic failure, and the structural evolution of the fleet is reducing the vulnerability over time. And there's genuine evidence for this. EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute, the power industry's own research body, compiled every documented weather-related generation reduction at U.S. nuclear plants between 2011 and 2020. 120 events across nearly a decade. The total capacity lost across all of those events, combined, amounted to less than 0.1% of total nuclear generation during that period. Their word for it was essentially negligible. That number deserves to sit in the room for a minute. Less than 0.1%. Every shutdown, every derate, every emergency variance I've described in this investigation, Millstone, Browns Ferry, Braidwood, Prairie Island, DC, Cook, all of them, added together, removed a fraction of the fleet's total output. The system absorbed every one without a cascading failure, without a blackout, without a grid emergency, and France's trajectory supports the adaptation case directly. The 91% reduction in curtailment losses between 2003 and 2022 is the strongest piece of evidence that investment works. France identified the problem, committed public and utility capital, redesigned operational calendars, built cooling upgrades, and cut the losses from 5.5 terawatt hours to half a terawatt hour. The problem didn't disappear. Goldfish still shut down in 2025, but its impact on grid reliability shrank dramatically. The American fleet is also evolving in ways that reduce aggregate vulnerability. Gas-fired combined cycle plants, which need roughly 30% of the cooling water that traditional steam plants require, have been steadily displacing coal in the generation mix. More than 58 gigawatts of new capacity came online in the past year. Solar, battery storage, gas, and wind, diversifying the supply base away from water-dependent thermal generation. Scanlon's research on the Texas drought showed that fuel switching to gas turbines provided a genuine drought resilience pathway, and the long-term retirement of once-through coal plants, even if messy and contested through the 202(c) orders, is removing the most water-intensive generators from the fleet. NERC's 2026 assessment concluded that every assessment area can meet normal peak demand. That finding is built on detailed modeling, generator availability, transmission capacity, demand forecasts, reserve margins calculated region by region. The margins, while tighter in some areas than the industry would like, are positive across the board. And the grid management infrastructure is designed for stress. Demand response programs that can shed load voluntarily, emergency procedures that activate in sequence, and real-time coordination between regional operators. That infrastructure has been tested through heat waves, polar vortex events, and hurricanes. It works. And there's one more piece of evidence for the manageable case that I think carries genuine weight. The 2026 Southwest heat wave that already hit this spring, the event Yale Climate Connections called one of the 6 most astonishing weather events of the century, was a real-world stress test. Temperatures shattered records across the desert Southwest, and the grid held, prices spiked, conservation alerts were issued, peaking plants ran flat out, but the lights stayed on. In a landscape of catastrophic headlines, the fact that a record-setting heat event didn't produce cascading blackouts is itself evidence of resilience. The system has shock absorbers. They've been used, they've worked. This interpretation is not wrong. It's not naive. It accounts for the actual historical data, and it rests on a structural argument that deserves to be taken seriously. The fleet is changing. Once through cooling, which drove the most dramatic curtailments, is declining as a share of generation. 23% and falling. The plants replacing them, gas combined cycle with cooling towers, solar, wind, battery, are less water dependent or water independent entirely. If the transition continues at its current pace, the portion of the fleet exposed to cooling water constraints will shrink decade by decade, and the regulatory system, for all its fragmentation, has tools. The NRC can issue emergency license amendments. The EPA and state agencies can grant thermal variances. Plant operators can and do invest in cooling upgrades. TVA's $160 million investment at Browns Ferry being the clearest example. The adaptive capacity exists. It's been demonstrated. If you believe that the pace of fleet modernization will continue, that adaptation investments at individual plants will accumulate into fleet-wide resilience, and that drought and warming trends will stay within the range the current regulatory framework can accommodate, then this interpretation says the system bends. It absorbs the hits. It doesn't break. I want to be clear that I'm presenting this interpretation fairly and completely. There are smart, careful people in the utility industry, at NERC, and at EPRI who hold this view and have the data to support it. When NERC says every assessment area can meet normal peak demand, that's not spin. It's a quantitative assessment based on detailed generation and demand modeling. I respect it. But, Part 15, the case that the system is degrading. The second interpretation takes the same data and reads it through a different lens. Not as a system managing a problem successfully, but as a system slowly consuming the safety margin it needs to survive the event it hasn't yet faced. The difference between the two interpretations isn't the facts, it's the timeline and the trajectory. This interpretation starts with Van Vliet, the nature climate change modeling that projects 4.4 to 16% of U.S. summer thermoelectric capacity at risk between 2031 and 2060. That's not a fringe projection. It's published in one of the most selective journals in climate science, replicated by multiple groups and consistent with the IEA's independent estimate of 12% global capacity reduction by 2040. The researchers behind it, Van Vliet, Lettenmeyer, Yearsley, and in the 2016 follow-up, Weiberg, Leduc, and Riahi are among the most cited experts in water energy nexus science. The EPRI number, less than 0.1% downwards, is accurate for the period it covers. But the conditions during that period were milder than what's arriving. 2011 to 2020 did not include a summer where Lake Powell's inflow hit 13% of average. It did not include a Lake Mead elevation of 1,020 feet. It did not include a Pacific Northwest snowpack at 52% of normal, while the Southwest was simultaneously in exceptional drought. The conditions that produced EPRI's reassuring statistic are not the conditions the system is entering. Extrapolating past performance into a future where every relevant variable is trending worse isn't caution. It's assuming the road ahead is flat because the road behind you was flat, and the degradation isn't abstract. It shows up in specific, documented plant-level changes that tell a consistent story. The Browns Ferry curtailment record, 2007, 2010, 2011. 3 events in 5 years, each requiring expensive operational adjustments before the $160 million retrofit intervened. But even after the retrofit, the underlying trend, a warming Tennessee River, hasn't reversed. The engineering buys time against a curve that keeps moving. Millstone's intake limit raised from 75 to 80 degrees, south, 5 degrees of safety margin spent in a single license amendment. The Sound hasn't stopped warming since 2014. How many more 5-degree adjustments can the safety analysis absorb before the emergency cooling assumptions that the whole system depends on begin to erode? That question hasn't been answered publicly by the NRC, but it has a physical answer, and the physical answer has a limit. Braidwood's cooling pond temperature crept from 98 to 100 to 102. Turkey Point from 100 to 104. Hope Creek operates with a 24-hour average UHS limit of 89 degrees and a maximum of 93. Each of these numbers represents a line drawn in the engineering analysis. Each time a plant approaches or exceeds that line, the operator has to choose between requesting a variance, requesting a license amendment, or shutting down. Each choice has costs: financial, regulatory, and in terms of the safety margin that the NRC exists to protect. Behrens and Van Vliet's 2017 European analysis quantified this at the basin level. The number of river basins where water constraints significantly stress power generation rose from 47 to a projected 54 by 2030. 7 additional basins crossing from manageable to stressed within 16 years. The Tennessee, the Ohio, the Illinois, the Catawba, the Connecticut coast, these are the American equivalents, and they're on the same thermal trajectory, and the compound connections amplify the concern. Hydropower declining simultaneously. Coal plants kept alive by emergency orders that don't address their own cooling vulnerabilities. Agricultural and data center water competition intensifying. Interconnection reliability degrading when entire regions heat simultaneously. None of these is a cooling water problem by itself, but each one erodes a piece of the system's ability to compensate when a cooling water event hits. This interpretation says the EPRI number is true for the past. The Van Vliet projection is the best available science for the future, and the gap between them, between a backward-looking statistic measured under milder conditions and a forward-looking model calibrated to the warming trajectory the system is actually on, is where the risk lives. The system is not in crisis today. I've been careful about that throughout this investigation. No documented cooling water event has produced a cascading grid failure in the United States, but the system is losing margin. At individual plants, intake limits raised, discharge variances granted, cooling ponds running hotter. At the fleet level, once through plants aging into a climate they weren't designed for. At the system level, hydro declining, coal retirements frozen by emergency orders that don't address cooling, interconnection imports degrading under regional scale heat. The degradation is measurable. It's documented in NRC filings, NPDES variance requests, Bureau of Reclamation elevation data, USGS river temperature records, and NERC reliability assessments. It's not a model output, it's the observed trajectory of every relevant variable, trending in the same direction over the same period across the same geography. And the investments needed to reverse that trajectory, the kind of fleet-wide strategic cooling investment that France undertook, haven't begun in the United States. Individual plant adaptations have happened, but the systemic program that would address the $95 billion EPRI estimate, the multi-decade license extensions, and the widening gap between thermal limits and actual thermal conditions? It doesn't exist yet. The French proved it's possible. The American system hasn't started. The weight of the peer-reviewed literature sits with this interpretation. That's not advocacy, it's a description of where the published evidence concentrates. Von Vliet, Lettenmeyer, Behrens, the IEA, every major modeling effort points the same direction. The intermediate interpretation is the one the science most directly supports. Part 16, the case for a threshold. Nobody has tested. The third interpretation is the one that keeps me up at night, not because I believe it's likely, but because the conditions for it are physically possible, the consequences would be severe, and no system test has ever been run under the scenario it describes. Here's the scenario. A multi-week heat dome parks over the central or southeastern United States during peak summer to late July, early August. The kind of persistent blocking high pressure pattern that climate scientists have documented becoming more frequent and more stationary as the Arctic warms and the jet stream slows. River temperatures climb past 90 degrees across the Tennessee, Ohio, and upper Mississippi basins simultaneously. Nuclear plants on those rivers, Browns Ferry, Watts Bar, Sequoia in the TVA system, Davis-Bess and Perry on Lake Erie, Braidwood and its cooling pond in Illinois begin hitting their UHS intake limits and derating. Coal plants on the same rivers hit their NPDES discharge limits and throttle back. Hydropower in the West is already depleted. Glen Canyon has dropped below minimum power pool. Hoover is running at 60%. The Columbia system is producing at half capacity on 52% snowmelt. Gas turbines across the affected regions are running at maximum output to fill the gap. But gas prices have spiked because every generator in a 12-state footprint is bidding for the same molecule. Pipeline capacity that was adequate under normal conditions is fully subscribed. Spot market prices are climbing through levels that make every additional megawatt hour exponentially more expensive. Simultaneously, electricity demand shatters the previous record. 110 degrees in Memphis, 108 in St. Louis, 98 in Chicago with a dew point of 78 sewers, the kind of wet bulb heat that makes air conditioning not a comfort but a medical necessity. Every residential unit running at full compressor, every commercial building maxing its cooling plant, every hospital, every nursing home, every data center drawing peak load from a grid that is losing generation of capacity by the hour. In this scenario, multiple gigawatts of baseload thermal generation derate or go offline on the same day in the same interconnection driven by the same physical event. The reserve margin, the cushion between available generation and peak demand, goes to zero or negative, and the system does what every grid does when reserves are exhausted: controlled load shedding, rolling blackouts, rotating outages, not triggered by a mechanical failure or a cyber attack or a fuel shortage. triggered because the water was too hot and the demand was too high and the backups were too depleted, all on the same 112-degree afternoon. Imagine being the grid operator, the person sitting in the MISO or PJM or SPP control room at 2 in the afternoon, watching the real-time display. Generation capacity ticking down as plant after plant hits its thermal limit and the operators call in derates. Demand climbing through the afternoon peak as temperatures break records across a 12-state region. The import lines from neighboring balancing authorities reading lower than the day-ahead forecast, because those systems are in the same heat dome and their own plants are struggling with the same warm rivers. Battery storage that covered yesterday's evening peak is discharged and won't recharge meaningfully until solar generation ramps tomorrow morning. You've issued every conservation alert. You've activated every interruptible load contract. You've called every peaking unit in the queue, and the numbers on the screen still don't balance. The gap between generation and demand is narrowing, and it's narrowing from both directions. That's the scenario. It hasn't happened in the United States. I need to state that plainly, because this channel doesn't trade in predictions dressed up as evidence. No documented cooling water event anywhere in the American grid has produced the cascading, multi-gigawatt compound failure I've just described. But the conditions for it are assembling in real time, and the distance between where we are and where that scenario lives is measured in degrees, river degrees, reservoir feet, and the number of plants simultaneously touching their limits on the same July afternoon. Lake Powell at 13% of average inflow. Lake Mead projected toward 1,020 feet. Snowpack at 52% of normal in the Pacific Northwest. 60% of the lower 48 in drought. Nuclear plants operating on intake margins that have already been raised once or twice. Coal plants kept alive by emergency orders on rivers that may not be able to cool them. Michael Weber at the University of Texas called the heat plus drought combination a recipe for future blackouts. That was not a prediction. It was a description of the physics, the scissors effect operating at its theoretical maximum. Supply and demand converging from opposite directions, driven by the same cause in the same region at the same time. And the question this interpretation raises is not whether the physics permits it, it does, but whether the summer that tests it is this one, the next one, or the one after that. The mechanism is in place. The trigger conditions are assembling. The specific combination of extremes that would produce the outcome. The simultaneous convergence of thermal derates, hydro depletion, record demand, and interconnection failure has not yet arrived in the United States. That absence is a fact. So is the trajectory toward it. I'm going to leave this interpretation where I think intellectual honesty requires it, not as a forecast, not as a warning, but as a physically possible scenario supported by documented trends. The EPRI data says the past was manageable. The Van Vliet data says the future will be harder. This interpretation asks, is there a point between here and there where manageable stops being the right word? The evidence says yes. The evidence doesn't say when, and that uncertainty is not a reason to dismiss it. It's a reason to watch. Part 17, what we know and what we don't. There are things this investigation has established with high confidence, things that remain contested, and things that are genuinely unknown. And I think it's worth being precise about each. What we know. The mechanism is real and documented beyond any reasonable dispute. Nuclear plants hit thermal limits before coal plants due to NRC safety requirements embedded in General Design Criterion 44 and each plant's technical specifications. This has been demonstrated at Browns Ferry in 2007, 2010, and 2011, at Millstone in 2012, at Braidwood in 2012, at Gulfec in 2025, and at Besnau in 2025. Once through cooled plants withdraw enormous volumes of water and are vulnerable to both low flow and high temperature. The compound scissors effect, heat simultaneously cutting supply and raising demand, is physically real, well documented, and has manifested in every major U.S. drought since 2007. What we know. Adaptation works and is happening. France reduced curtailment losses by 91% through strategic investment over 2 decades. TVA's retrofit at Browns Ferry improved thermal tolerance at a cost of $160 million. The U.S. fleet is diversifying away from once-through cooling. Gas combined cycle provides a less water-intensive alternative. Solar, wind, and battery storage are growing at record pace. These are measurable, documented gains that reduce aggregate vulnerability. The system is not standing still. What we know: the conditions are getting worse on every measured axis. Lake Powell's inflow at 13% of average. Lake Mead projected toward 1,020 feet by mid-2027. Drought covering 60% of the lower 48 as of early June 2026. River temperatures trending warmer across every major basin with continuous monitoring records. Western snowpack declining. Reservoir evaporation increasing as temperatures climb and humidity drops. These aren't projections. These are measurements. The trends are in the data, updated weekly, and available for anyone to verify. What is contested? How fast the observed degradation translates into grid-level reliability risk. EPRI says the historical losses have been negligible, less than 0.1%. Van Vliet's modeling projects 4 to 16% summer capacity reductions within the next few decades. The gap between these assessments is real, and it reflects genuinely different analytical approaches. EPRI is measuring what happened. Van Vliet is modeling what will happen if documented trends continue. The EPRI measurement covers a period when conditions were milder. The Van Vliet model incorporates warming trajectories that make future conditions worse. Neither is wrong on its own terms. The disagreement is about whether the past is a reliable guide to the future, and that depends on whether you believe the climate is changing fast enough to outrun the system's adaptive capacity. The evidence I've assembled in this investigation suggests it is. The French case shows adaptation can work, but only if it's undertaken proactively and at scale. The American case shows it hasn't been, not yet, not at fleet level. What is genuinely unknown? Whether a single extreme event or a single extreme summer can produce the simultaneous multi-gigawatt compound failure that would cross the threshold from manageable curtailments to systemic grid stress. No natural experiment has tested this scenario under the conditions now developing. The closest analog is France in 2003 DARS, which produced fleet-wide curtailments across multiple river basins, but not blackouts, in a system that carries more reserve margin than many American grid regions. The specific event that would distinguish between Interpretation 2 and Interpretation 3 hasn't happened yet, and the data that would confirm or rule out each interpretation will come from real-time observations over the coming months and years, all of it publicly available, all of it trackable, and all of it specific enough to serve as trigger benchmarks for this investigation going forward. Here are the numbers to watch. If Glen Canyon Dam drops below 3,490 feet east minimum power pool, that's a gigawatt of hydropower gone from the western grid. You can track this yourself on the Bureau of Reclamation's website. The data updates weekly. If Lake Powell's annual inflow stays at or below 20% of average for a second consecutive year, the system's capacity to recover, to refill the reservoir through future snowmelt, shrinks to a point where even a good water year might not be enough to restore generation. That number comes from the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center. If Lake Mead hits the Bureau of Reclamation's most probable projection of 1,020 feet by mid-2027, Hoover Dam's output will be severely curtailed and the entire lower Colorado water delivery system will be in crisis. If any NRC enforcement discretion request appears during a summer peak, meaning a nuclear plant is asking the Commission for permission to operate past its licensed intake temperature during high demand conditions, that's the strongest signal that the margins have eroded to the point where the regulatory system itself is being tested. These requests are filed publicly in the NRC's Adams database. They're searchable, and if NRC's seasonal assessments begin flagging thermal generation risk explicitly, not just drought and hydro risk, but thermal plant derating risk tied to cooling water availability, that would mark a shift in how the Reliability Authority itself characterizes the threat. These are the benchmarks. They're specific, they're measurable, and this channel will be tracking every one of them. The data doesn't tell us which of the three interpretations is correct. What it tells us is what each one costs if it turns out to be wrong. If interpretation 1, manageable, is correct, and we invest in adaptation anyway, we've spent money on grid infrastructure that makes the system more resilient, which has value regardless. If interpretation 2, degrading RO, is correct and we don't invest, the costs compound year after year as more plants hit more limits more often, and replacement power gets more expensive. If interpretation 3, threshold, is correct and we haven't prepared, the cost is measured in blackouts during heat waves. And blackouts during extreme heat aren't just inconveniences. They're life-threatening emergencies, concentrated in the populations least able to escape them: the elderly, the medically vulnerable, the people without the resources to leave. That asymmetry, the difference in downside risk between acting too soon and acting too late, is the strongest argument for investment that this investigation can make. Not because the worst case is certain. It isn't. I've been clear about that. But because the cost of being wrong about the worst case is categorically different from the cost of being wrong about the best case. And a careful person, the kind of person who watches this channel, accounts for asymmetry. Part 18. The vigil I started this investigation with a question that sounds simple and isn't. What happens when the rivers that cool America's most reliable power plants get too hot? The answer, after weeks of research and thousands of data points, is this. It depends on how many things go wrong at once. One plant hitting its thermal limit is an event. The grid absorbs it, the utility buys replacement power on the spot market, and files for a variance. The lights stay on. Several plants hitting their limits during the same heat wave while hydropower is depleted and demand is spiking and the neighboring grid can't export because it's in the same heat dome. That's different. That's the scenario where the margins that have saved us so far run out. And the conditions assembling right now, the drought, the reservoir decline, the warming rivers, the thinning safety margins at plant after plant, are pushing the system closer to that scenario than it's ever been. The thesis I set out to prove was not that the grid is about to collapse. The evidence doesn't support that, and I wouldn't claim it does. The thesis is that the power plants America built to never fail, nuclear reactors, the backbone of the baseload fleet, carry a hidden vulnerability written into their own safety rules. A vulnerability that makes them the first to shut down when rivers warm, not despite their engineering excellence, but because of it. And that the drought and warming, now tightening across the country, are squeezing those rules from every direction. At the same moment, everything else the grid depends on. Hydropower, coal, gas supply, interconnection imports, is also being squeezed. The evidence supports the thesis fully. Every part of it is documented. Every claim is sourced. And the trajectory is clear. What the evidence does not support is certainty about timing. The degradation is measurable. The direction is established. But whether the system crosses from manageable to critical this summer, or 5 summers from now, or $10, that depends on variables the data can track but can't predict. How extreme the heat gets. How long it lasts. How many plants hit their limits on the same day. Whether the investments that France made and America hasn't begun before or after the first real compound event. And the most important thing I've learned in this investigation is that the vulnerability is structural, not accidental. It was designed in. The NRC thermal limits exist for good reason. They protect reactor safety. The NPDES discharge limits exist for good reason. They protect river ecosystems. The prior appropriation water law exists for historical reasons that made sense when it was written. None of these systems is broken. They're doing what they were designed to do. The problem is that they were designed for a climate that is disappearing. The French example shows the path forward exists. Invest in cooling infrastructure. Diversify the generation of fleet away from water-dependent technologies. Build the dry-cooled advanced reactors that eliminate the vulnerability at the source. Schedule proactively. Accept the cost, because the cost of not acting compounds every year. Whether the United States follows that path or waits for the crisis that forces it is not a question the data can answer. That's a question about institutions, about political will, about whether the gap between the speed of the climate and the speed of the response can be narrowed before the margins that have protected us so far are gone. I've spent weeks inside this data, NRC filings, USGS river gauges, Bureau of Reclamation projections, NPDES permit records, peer-reviewed modeling, utility financial statements. And the picture that emerges isn't the one I expected when I started. I expected a crisis. What I found was something quieter and, in some ways, more concerning. A slow erosion of margin, documented in the records of plant after plant, river after river, summer after summer, with the trajectory pointing in one direction and the institutional response lagging behind it. We'll be tracking every benchmark I named in Part 17. The reservoir levels, the river temperatures, the NRC filings and enforcement discretion requests, the NERC seasonal assessments, the inflow forecast from the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center. All of it publicly available, all of it verifiable. And when this story moves, and it will move because the physics doesn't pause, we'll be here. The rivers are warming, the reservoirs are falling, the safety margins that kept the lights on last summer are thinner this summer, and the plants that America built to never fail are learning, 1 degree at a time, that never is a word the climate doesn't recognize.